All right. So a couple of things. I'm going to play this video. This is a promotional video for the organization that we are launching this year. After about 10 years of working with the Nehemiah Foundation, which is a private foundation, we are expanding into a public charity, and so it's a very similar vision. Anyway, this will give a good framework for the talk that I'm about to give, and so I'll just play it.
Imagine if artists had more freedom within the church than without her. Meet Micah. Micah is a Christian, and Micah is an artist. But Micah doesn't want to be a...
I don't like that, sorry. I don't know. It's playing quite choppily.
Do you need to maybe transfer it to the hard drive? It's playing off the
digital
file.
Is it playing off of the doodad? Oh, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, so you got a little preview of that. You're going to get another one.
Try the VLC media player. That's usually better.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay, so while this is doing this thing, I'm going to speak probably for about 40 minutes or less, because I follow Spurgeon's advice. In lectures to my students, he said you should absolutely not ever speak longer than 40 minutes. He says a man, if he prepares his material well, can speak for 40 minutes. If he prepares his material not so well, we'll speak about 50 minutes. If he has absolutely nothing to say, it'll take him about an hour to say it. So that's Spurgeon. That's Spurgeon.
What are you saying about the last speaker?
I'm not saying anything. He had a lot of material, and it was very well presented. But I generally going to keep it to like 40 minutes or less. Thanks, Rusty. That's thank you for that. You leave it to Rusty to make things rather awkward. No, so anyway, yeah. So we've got that'll leave about 20 minutes after that or more. Where I would like to field questions, because usually when I talk about these things, there are all sorts of questions. There's questions about specifics and how do you actually get this working, and I know we're having a Q&A.
So you are going to have a 60-minute.
I'm not. I'm hoping that I'm going to try and fill the time,
Okay.
but it's not going to all be me talking, I hope. Anyway, so yeah, there's oftentimes a lot of questions as far as how do you actually make this work? What about this specific issue? What about this specific issue? 'Cause I'm going to speak largely about foundational ideas for 30 or 40 minutes, and a lot of times, the specifics, when you start getting into the nuances, things get weird. So just if you have questions, just write them down, and I'll try and field them after. And then if that doesn't satisfy your urgent need for more clarification, there will be the Q&A session.
That's fine.
Yeah, so.
Imagine if artists had more freedom within the church than without her. Meet Micah. Micah is a Christian, and Micah is an artist. But Micah doesn't want to be a Christian artist. As a Christian artist, Micah would feel boxed in. Because Christian art no longer describes art made by Christians, but rather a genre which often restricts honesty, variety, and depth. Sadly, people outside the church give Micah more freedom to pursue his art the way he feels called to. But this freedom they give is usually motivated by indifference, not support. So Micah ends up between two communities with no place to call home. If this story ends here, everyone loses. The church loses a visionary, the world loses a missionary, and Micah is left alone. There are thousands of artists like Micah all across the country. In order to rebuild the relationship between artists and the church, non-biblical restrictions need to be lifted. And that's why Renew the Arts is on a mission to liberate Christian creativity. Don't you know a Micah or two? Won't you help us to help them?
Thanks. So a lot of people, when they see that, they're immediately red flags. So feel free to ask me questions at the end. What do you mean liberate? You know. But I'll talk a little bit about that in the course of this talk. So whenever I come and talk to people about supporting artists from the church, the first question that I almost always get, whether they're from well-meaning or not so well-meaning people, is the church does not support other professions. Why should the church support artists? Why is the profession of artist different? Why should the church support artists and not others? So a common framing of this objection, I actually found a pretty good representation of this from author Ted Kluck, who says, there is this feeling that churches aren't adequately supporting artists, musicians, writers, visual artists in their midst. However, I don't exactly see churches supporting software designers, salesmen, or farmers either. That's not the church's purpose. And it seems that the artists who are making the most noise about not being supported are the ones who may not have the talent to really cut it in the marketplace anyway. I don't know of any working artists who complain that their church doesn't support their efforts. Art is tough. Making a living at art is tough. So we hear that a lot, especially when we deal with businessmen, and we say, and they tell us, why should we give you money for the arts rather than giving money to missions or to this church for their particular ministry? And it's a good question, but I think that it rests on two misconceptions concerning the arts and the purpose of the church, actually. And one of those misconceptions is that art is not central, or at least crucial, to the work of the church. And especially in Reformed communities, this is a misconception that kind of boggles my mind, because we say we're sola scriptura. And that means that we believe that the scriptures, as they are all necessary and that they are sufficient. Well, if you look at the scriptures, I mean, it's not a hard, it's just a casual perusal, all right? Look at the scriptures and say, what's the genre of the scriptures from beginning to end, right? You have a vast majority of narrative and poetry. Vast majority of the scriptures are narrative and poetry. If you go to most, even Reformed seminaries, and you try and ask them, okay, so do you have any classes here about teaching people how to tell stories or hear stories or interpret stories or understand stories, narratives? Do you have any classes here about how to read and write poetry? Zero. None. And you're sitting here going, guys, how are you going to read the Bible in the way the Bible is written if you're not trying to read it in the way that it was written? And so there's a major holdup there that I think needs to be fixed. And part of the problem is that they view art as being peripheral. Most Christians have a view of art that is one of two things. So whether they're left-leaning Catholics or right-leaning Reformed conservative Protestants, generally speaking, they think one of two things about the arts. They believe either that the arts are gratuitous, that the Catholics will say this, that art is gratuitous, that it is a symbol of God's excessive grace, that He's given us more than we need, it's not necessary, and so basically useless, non-utilitarian. And then you have on the second belief, you have that if art is useful, it's useful as an adornment of your message. So you can beautify your message with art. So like you have a sermon, what would make this sermon really snazzy is some illustrations or, a nice story in the middle there to kind of enliven it a little bit. But basically it's just a dressed up sermon. Okay, neither of those ideas are biblical. They're just frankly not biblical. If art was not necessary for the revelation of God's character, then He wouldn't have used it in the scriptures and throughout history. That's just flatly the case. If all that was necessary for the revelation of God's character is propositional sermons, that is what the Bible would be made of. And it's not. It's not made of that. The majority of the Bible is not propositional. There's a thin sliver in the New Testament of propositional texts, letters and epistles, and sermons. But even when you look at Jesus' ministry, even when you look at the ministry of the prophets, all the way through the history of the church, Jesus spoke in parables. It says specifically that He spoke mostly in parables. Even the Sermon on the Mount, which is the only thing that's called a sermon from Him, does not look like any sermon that I've ever heard from any preacher ever. So there's a really big disconnect here that needs to be remedied. And really, we need to review our ideas of what the purpose of art is. I would say that art, at least one of the purposes of art, and thank you, Jane, for talking about this. She talked about how art is for the revelation of God's glory or God's character. She talked about art as beautifying. Art can beautify. She talked about art as the transmission of education, of some message, some meaning. And she talked about it as a tool for communication. The arts in the scriptures have all of those purposes as well. And so the other major misconception that is in this, and that kind of flows out of this idea that art is peripheral, that art is not, that has no real utility in the church and purpose in the church, is this idea that art should be treated like a commodity. So that flows naturally from the idea that art is not central to the purpose of the church's message and work, is that it should be treated like a commodity. Just like if you are a salesman of widgets or a software designer or whatever, it's all the same. It's all commodities, right? So like, why should I buy, why should the church support this baker in his life if he can't cut it in the marketplace? I mean, he even says that. He says that specifically. That maybe the reason why that all these artists are squawking about not getting support is because they can't cut it in the marketplace, as if their art is yet another product to be sold in the marketplace. Well, if art is central to the mission of the church, or at least crucial to the mission of the church, as it seems like it should be if we're going to follow the scriptural example of so many of the prophets writing poetry, doing performance art, writing drama, so many of the Psalms, the lyrical poetry of the Proverbs, the lyricism of Ecclesiastes, the dramatic vision of Revelation, the parables of Jesus. I mean, I'm talking like, it's like so overwhelming. I don't understand why we're not getting it. Then that means that what would happen if you just replace this idea of the artist with a preacher? Right? So what happens if you force a preacher to cut it in the marketplace? What happens to the message then? You have tickling ears, right? You have preachers who say, well, in order to get people in the pews, in order to keep the revenue streams coming, I need to tailor my message to the tastes of my audience. Because that's what you do when you make commodities. When you turn the gospel into a commodity, you say, how can I serve the tastes of my audience? And so this idea that art is a commodity is a major obstacle to making the kinds of art that God wants us to make. Because if an artist in the church has to say, I either need to fit my art into this very narrow category of Christian art, or I need to remove all these elements of offensive Christianity out of it in order to tailor it to the tastes of the world, well then what you end up having is a perverted art. You have an art that becomes constrained and distorted to the taste of whatever audience is being catered to. It's very, very, very problematic, and I see it happening over and over and over again. There's been a lot of talk about this in terms of CCM, Christian contemporary music. You saw the robot up there who was flipping the guy around and setting him into his 3 different acceptable options. It's called the CCM 3000. So it's like this sort of machine that constrains people into this like Christian mold, this Christian model. And what's really interesting is in the realm of that constraint, which is very superficially based, right? Like, in order to be a Christian, you can't say these certain words. You can't have these certain themes. If you're going to make music, you can't use dissonance. You can't use distortion. You can't use swing. You can't use, there's no sense in which any of that is allowed to be used. It all has to fit into this really narrow thing. Well, what happens with that is, what if you have an artist like Isaiah, who had some really unpleasant things to say, right? Or an artist like David, who also had some really unpleasant things to say. What happens to that? I mean, I think about this sometimes. If the prophets came to the modern Christian distributors with their poetry and said, would you publish this? How much of it do you think would actually be published? I mean, seriously, blessed is the one who dashes their little one upon the rocks. We can't publish this. We can't publish this. This is terrible, right? Like, this is very offensive. And so there's so much in the scriptures that actually is unpleasant, because when God comes to a sinful people, he talks about their sin in a realistic way. And, we shouldn't shy away from that as artists. And what ends up happening is, when you think art should be treated like a commodity, like a product, you remove all those things, because those are the unpleasant parts of your commodity, and it doesn't sell, right? Okay, so then people would say, well, here's this problem, though, is that art and preaching are not the same thing. That you can't say that an artist is like a preacher, because that's really where this whole thing goes, right? Is that if I'm talking about why the church should support artists, the main issue is they should only support artists if art is actually as central to the presentation of God's revelation of himself as preaching propositional sermons is. Now, I'd say the scriptures give us some idea that art is necessary. But also, even not just the mode of the scriptures, but the actual content of the scriptures also tells us that. The verse that most people go to is in Romans, where Paul says, how will they hear without a preacher? Right? And so the idea is that if you are not called to be a preacher, then it's through the preaching, it's through those words, it's through those propositional sermons that people are saved. Well, there's just one issue with that, and that is within the verse itself, it says, have they not heard? I say that they have heard, for it says in Psalm 19, their words have gone out to the ends of the earth. Now he's quoting Psalm 19. Who is the preacher in Psalm 19? Who? That's not the preacher that David's talking about. David's talking about a preacher within there whose words are going to the ends of the earth. Nature. The stars. Meaning that the art of God in the world is enough of a sermon to condemn those who see it. Now, Paul already says that in Romans 1, but the reality is that God's, again, Paul, thank you for quoting this from Proverbs, that the glory of God is to conceal a matter, the glory of kings is to search a matter out. That the power of art, one of the greatest powers of art, is that it is able to conceal the matter until a person has already been convicted of its truth. Now, think about it this way. David sins with Bathsheba. David is a righteous man, we know, right? He has a heart like God. So, man after God's own heart, as he says. So when Nathan comes to David, why didn't Nathan just go, David, you're an adulterer, you're a murderer, I know what happened with you and Bathsheba, here is the reasons why that's wrong, and repent. Why didn't he do that? Why did Nathan the prophet go to David and tell him a story? Because David's heart already recognized the truth of what was going on before his brain could get around to defending itself. Right? Now, obviously, there is a major problem with that. And that's why people are afraid of the arts. Because if it's possible for you to convince somebody in their heart that something is true before their mind has gotten around to defending it, you can see why the world has used the arts so effectively to persuade us through our hearts of things that our minds know are not true. Right? But God also uses the arts to persuade our hearts to love those things that are good and beautiful. I mean, it even says that God's holiness is beautiful, that we're supposed to look upon the beauty of the truth, the beauty of God's holiness, and that is supposed to persuade our hearts to love him, because he desires voluntary praise. He desires voluntary love. He doesn't want us to just force ourselves to worship him because that's what we're supposed to do. He wants us to be drawn in our hearts toward him. And that is why art and worship have had a long-term relationship within the scriptures, both from the Old Testament all the way into the New Testament. And it's why I believe it's crucial, the arts are crucial to the work of the church today as they were in the Old Testament. There's another thing that Ted Kluck's quote sort of brings to light that I think kind of flows from this idea of art as a commodity. And that is that there's a distinction made in the scriptures between art that is commoditizable and or arts that are commoditizable and arts that is not. So, for instance, again, Paul, thank you, and Jane, thank you for bringing up Bezalel. Bezalel and Aholiab are both mentioned in Exodus in the formation of the tabernacle. It says that Bezalel was filled with the Spirit of God so that he could design, right? He came up with the designs. God gave him designs. It also says that God gave Moses the pattern from the mountain, right? So what these are called are what I would call visionary arts. But there were also people in the tabernacle work who had willing hearts, who came and did the craft of actually executing those designs and those patterns. They didn't come up with the designs and patterns, but they were tasked to do them, to execute them, right? So the weavers, the engravers, these kinds of the craftspeople and craftsmen throughout are talked about. In most Protestant circles, and Rushdoony said this, that he said that art is basically craft. And you talked about this with the workmanship, the maasa, that has a lot to do with craft, with work, with actually working with your hands, workmanship. These words are translated out of the Hebrew into English like that all over the place in the scriptures. But there's also talk of artists, designs, visions, patterns. And so there's these two parts to the tabernacle building, to all the art within the scriptures, the artistry and the artisanship, the vision and the craft, right? Well, the thing about craft is that if you don't believe art has vision, or that the vision isn't important, and all you focus on is craft is neither good nor bad, right? So you can have good craft, and by good or bad I mean moral. Craft in itself is not morally wicked or righteous in itself. It's either good or bad. It's either, like you said, either good art or bad art, and that has to do with craft. So when I watch a movie, the content, the ideas, the vision of the movie, set that aside for a second, I can judge it on terms of craft. How's the cinematography? How's the directing? How's the editing? How's the writing? How's the acting? How crafty are these things? How at the top of their game are all the people who worked on this? And usually, they're really good. Usually they're very, very well crafted. And unfortunately, a lot of Christian art is not terribly well crafted, and that's problematic. But it's not the only problem, okay? Because even if the craft is good, that doesn't mean the vision is good. If they had taken all these weavers who had willing hearts, and they were great engravers, and they were great weavers, and they knew all about tapestry, and they knew all about veils, but they were to just set aside God's pattern. To say, I don't care about your design, I don't care about your meanings, I don't care about what you have to say through this. I'm just going to do really great work. It's going to be ornate, it's going to be beautiful, right? Is that good art? No, no, it's not. It might be good craft, but it doesn't have the full thing. So I think within the church, when we start to believe that vision and craft are necessary together, that's when we really start to make good art. And there's lots of examples like this. Bach, for instance, had the vision. He had the craft. Okay, she's going to talk about Albrecht Dürer, who had a vision and had the craft. And those two things being put together, that's really what we're looking for. However, there are different kinds of artists. These willing-hearted people in the tabernacle, they were craft-oriented. They made really, really great crafts, but they didn't have a vision. Now, they could apply that craft to this vision or to that vision, still good craft, same craft, no matter the vision, right? What needs to be protected in the church from the corruptions, the tickling ear corruptions of the market, is the vision of artists who have been given things from God to do, right? So like, for instance, if you have an Isaiah or an Isaiah type in your church who has been given from God a poetry, a poetic idea, right, or a painting, an idea. He has an idea, and it's a very good idea, right? Well, that needs to be protected. It needs to be protected from tampering. Now, there's all sorts of instances where the Word of God was tampered with in the Old Testament the art of God was tampered with in order to appeal to people's ears, in order to tickle ears. You have the case of Ahab and Micaiah. Do you remember this? So Ahab had 400 prophets of God who came to him and did these artistic presentations, the dramatic prophet demonstrations. They held the horns and they would say, with this horn you will ram through, your enemies of Aram, and they will be no match for you. And they did these big dramatic presentations, and Ahab's like, oh yeah, like this. This is really nice. This makes me feel good about myself. And then Jehoshaphat sitting there with Ahab, and he's like, do you have anybody who, I don't know, tells the truth? and Ahab says, oh yeah, there's this one guy, but he never says anything good about me. And so he brings Micaiah on there, and Micaiah, mimicking the other artists who had just done their dramatic presentation, says, oh, king, you will win against the Arameans. And then Ahab's like, how many times have I abjured you? Always tell me the truth in the name of the Lord. And so, of course, Micaiah's like, oh yeah, you're going to die. You're going to die. It's all going to go south for you. Things are going to go really badly. And then he turns to Jehoshaphat, Ahab does, and says, didn't I tell you that he never says anything good about me? So this is an artist. This is a poet of God who is set aside for the 400 poets of God who will stamp an ichthus on their work and make you feel really good about yourself, but they're not telling you the truth of God. And there are other instances where, like Ahaz, the king, who was an idolater, got a design from the king of Assyria and altered the tabernacle space, altered the temple space. He took the other altar out. He altered it. Took the other altar out and put in this new altar of the design of the Assyrians, right? He also removed the Hiram's bronze calves from underneath the bath, and he put a rectangular tabernacle type thing underneath it instead. Or not tabernacle, but whatever. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Under the bath, he put like a little pedestal for it, but he removed the bulls that Hiram had designed at Solomon's direction. And so you have this altering of God's designs, right, in order to meet with a particular taste. Assyria is the tastemaker, so they're the power. So let's change all these things in order to match with their ideas of what is good art. But what ends up happening is that the meanings that God had intended through these patterns is perverted. Okay, so and Ahaz was totally rejected for this. He had his hands on the horns of the altar when God struck him with leprosy that broke out on his forehead, because he had the audacity to reinterpret God's designs in order to kowtow to the tastes of the world that he was living in. So it's a really important thing for the church then to protect the artists that have been given designs. Now, let's not elevate them and be like, oh, you're a prophet of your own strength. This is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that God has given certain people within your midst an artistic capacity, a creativity, and if we are forcing them to go into the world in order to cut it in the marketplace, do you really think that vision that God gives them is going to leave the world unscathed? It's not. It will not be unscathed. It will either be changed by the world's taste so that these people can eat bread and feed their families, right? I mean, which is a temptation. A man will sin for a loaf of bread. Don't tempt them. Or they will go out there and say, I refuse to change the vision God gave me. I'm going to maintain this vision. I'm going to work on my craft, even though I'm unsupported. And I have no way of getting the resources necessary to better my craft. I'll at least try and do it as best I can. And so they go through, they try and maintain their vision, and then all of a sudden what ends up happening is that the world doesn't want it. Now, that's too Christian. This is offensive. This is convicting. This is, say that churchy stuff for the church, right? And so it ends up being like Micah. A lot of these visionary artists end up between two communities. That is absolutely unacceptable. And that's why I believe that the church should protect these artists from temptation by drawing them back in and supporting them. So, and particularly visionary artists, craft-oriented artists are able to make a living in the world because their trade is able to serve a lot of different purposes, and it is more commoditizable. Visionary art is not commoditizable any more than the gospel is. As soon as you start selling the gospel, you start perverting the gospel. As soon as you start selling your vision, you start perverting your vision. That's just how it always has happened. That's how it will happen. Church has a responsibility to protect it. How? How can the church protect it? Well, there are two major ways that the church can protect it. On one side, you have individuals and you have corporate bodies. So on an individual level, you as a person, every single one of you, can do something in order to protect the vision that God has given to the artists that are in your midst. And the main way is be a discerning audience. Seriously, it doesn't cost you anything to do a whole lot for the artists in your midst. Learn to appreciate art. Set aside this whole idea that art is just for utility or for just adornment, and start to really appreciate what is going on in the arts, both in terms of craft and in terms of vision, and become a discerning audience. There are a lot of resources available for that. And it's not just going to benefit the artists in your midst, it will benefit you to do this as well. You will look at the poems in the scriptures and the stories in the scriptures with renewed interest and renewed life when you recognize the artistic creativity and skill that went into producing them. That will mean a lot to you. It will make a big difference to you. When you read about the tabernacle and you start thinking about what does the tabernacle mean? Why was it made out of gopher wood? Why was it the case that Nadab and Abihu had to be struck down and dead because they took a fire not from the altar in order to burn the incense? Why was that important? What does that mean? Right? There's an artistic reason for those things as well as a religious reason, and they're unified together in this visionary craft that's in the scriptures. You will learn a lot about it. But also, I can't tell you how much it means to artists when they hear back from people who are listening to their work, who are hearing their work, who are looking at their work and engaging with it in an intelligent way, in a discerning way, and asking them questions. Why did you make this decision? Why did you make this decision? What were you trying to communicate with this? Why did you use these color combinations? Why did you use these lines? Why did you use these chords? Why did you use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are the kind of questions that artists would love to talk your ear off about. I mean, they would love to talk to you about it. And it means a lot to them that you didn't just say, it was nice. It was pretty nice. It's cool. It's cool that somebody in the church is like, trying the whole music thing and stuff. Which is mostly what they get. It's really, seriously, it's very discouraging to be making art and pour your life into it, and for people to be like, it's cool as a luxury and everything, but get a real job. I don't know how many times the artists hear that. And so that's the first thing. The second thing that you can do as an individual is pay for art. Seriously, pay people to make art, commission pieces, and give them freedom to do the work however they choose to do it, which it takes a leap of faith. It does. It takes faith on your part to treat people like that and say, you know what, I'm going to give you freedom, and I know that means that you might do something that I don't really understand or I don't really appreciate. Just go ahead and do it. Just take that leap and then work, because by doing that, you draw these artists into the community, and there's accountability. There's a structure of accountability there. If you say, you know what, if you want to make a living, you can go out of the church and do your art elsewhere, well, where do you think they're going to go? Out of the church elsewhere. Yeah, and what happens is these artists, there are so many really great artists in the world making a living right now who should be making art for the church, and we're getting their leftovers. And it's terrible. That needs to change. So then corporately, churches can host workshops like this or conferences like this. These are great ways to educate people about the value and the importance of the arts. Also, they can put line items in their budget, seriously, for the commissioning of artistic work, for the beautification of the church, and for, I'm talking, I'm not even going to get into the regulative principle of worship or anything like that. Forget that. I'm talking about the space of the church, and the church being used as a space of beauty where the community can be involved as well, where you're doing a service to the community as a church. When you bring your artists in, you say, do good work. We will pay you to do good work. Do good work. And then the surrounding world looks at that and they say, these artists who are working at these churches, they are supported, they are loved, they are listened to. This is an engaged audience of people who really love this and really appreciate this. What's different about these people? Because think about it. In the Old Testament, who was the art of the temple for? It was clearly for believers. But in the Psalms, when David says, walk around the temple and survey the temple, who is he talking to there? He's not really necessarily talking to just believers. Unbelievers came from all over the world and said, this is a work of wonder. They weren't allowed inside. Do you understand? They never heard any sermon. And your friends who are unbelievers, they won't listen to sermons either. You can invite them to church, but they're probably not going to show up. And if they do, they're going to be like, oh, I didn't get much out of it. But they will come to a concert. They will go to a movie. They will look at a painting or go to an art museum with you. And there's so much of an opportunity to talk about the gospel through those things. Because when you survey the temple, when you go around it, you see the glory of God. When you stand in the courtyard of the Gentiles and listen to the songs that are emanating between the pillars, you hear the glory of God. And we need, as a church, to recover that attitude, that spirit of let's present the glory and beauty of God to the world, so that when they see the church, they don't see a mediocrity. And I'm telling you right now, as a church, we cannot rest until the church is a praise in the earth. And we should not let God rest until he makes the church a praise in the earth. And so that is why we are about this. That's why I think that you should be as well. Anyway, so that's all for now. Do we have any?
I just had a comment that
Yeah.
the world supports their artists. That's
They do.
why- I mean, it's just, we're just astounded.
Yes.
Do you think it's okay then for churches to pay, like musicians to come into the church for worship?
To pay them? Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
To bring them in for the worship service and pay them so that the music in a worship service is glorious?
Totally. Yeah, totally. In fact, there's a long history of that. Bach. We all appreciate the work of Bach. His little church paid him a salary to be their organist, and he wrote a piece for them every Sunday. And he had like 20 kids. So, I mean, they were paying for him to live, which is important. I think you pay your artist, your visionary artist to live, so that they can also produce work. But Bach produced so much other work too that everybody else appreciated. But it was because of the support of that little church paying him to be an organist that he was able to produce the other works that we've listened to today. Another example of this, we called our first foundation the Nehemiah Foundation for Cultural Renewal, simply because Nehemiah, one of the first actions Nehemiah took, okay, had not finished the wall protecting Jerusalem, okay, hadn't reestablished the political system, cultural, social system of Jerusalem. He brought the temple singers and artisans back into Jerusalem and gave them a job again. And he even told the people that had pushed them out and said, go tend your own field, go make a living out, go cut it in the marketplace. He said, why have you left the house of God desolate? Why have you sent these singers out? Why have you sent these musicians and these artisans out to tend their own field? These Levites, these singers, bring them back in and give them jobs. Before anything else, which is hilarious because you think about our emphases, right? It's a totally different emphasis. Like, we might pay for a preacher, and we're all big into politics, but when it comes to like renewal of the arts, it's like that's way down on the list. But to Nehemiah, that was the top. That was the top of his list. This is how to rejuvenate Jerusalem, rejuvenate her arts and her worship, and then everything else will follow. Any other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Wasn't the Art and Sistine Chapel commissioned by the church?
It was, yeah. And so one of the things that we're trying to get back to actually is a patron system. Now, there's a lot of corruption in the patron system of the Roman Catholic Church. But yes, and in fact, it was commissioned by a person who was not a believer. So in that case, it's really interesting that the church was setting the standard for what was beautiful, good, because they were paying for art. And so for Michelangelo, who's not a believer, he still came in and painted these things because that was who was paying the bills. So he did what they asked him to do.
That's an example of the craft.
Yeah.
Without
He had vision. He was a visionary artist as well. His vision was more from himself probably than anything else. But he's definitely a great and talented artist. But yeah, definitely. And one of the ways that we function, actually, and I'll tell you a little bit about it, all that stuff over there is free. You can take it. All of it's already been paid for. So the albums that we make, the art that we support and sponsor is all paid for by patronage. So, and it's a very similar model. We want to separate that art from the corruption of the marketplace, which means we go to artists and we say, make whatever you want. Seriously, make whatever God gives you to make, and be in this accountable community, be within the church, hear the feedback, because there are lots of decisions that artists might want to make, and you're like, I don't know if you should make that decision. Have a conversation, and try and work through that. But ultimately, we support them. They pay us nothing. Artists pay us nothing to record in our studio or to have their books typeset or published or anything like that. And then we give those things away. And we say, if you feel led to donate, donate. But all of the offerings in the Old Testament, like you talked about, they were all voluntary offerings. So the people wanted to give. And it's that voluntary offering, and that there's freeness to that whole thing. That it takes a lot of faith to function in that way. It takes a lot of faith for us to function in this way. We don't force anyone or coerce anyone or manipulate anyone to do anything, and a lot of times it's a little bit of a struggle, but God has been faithful to us, and I think that through us He's been faithful also to a lot of these artists in that sort of patron model.
I know that you've talked about the accountability component of it, but ultimately it still does come down to that, does it not? You say we're gonna commission an artist, we're gonna say to an artist, create whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, there still has to be some discernment at some point on content.
Totally, and here's what I would say is important in those terms. That it's better for the accountability of an artist for them to be operating within the church
I agree
than outside the church.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess the emphasis that I was thinking about was just, at some point, obviously if the artist creates something that from a content standpoint or from a communication of an idea standpoint, you say, look, we just can't go there.
Right.
That conversation needs to be had.
It is had sometimes.
Okay.
And we have had that conversation with certain artists. We've also allowed a lot of things that people think are beyond what they would feel comfortable with, content-wise. And there is a give and take there. We recognize that we are in a particular community, and we do take that into account. And it's also the case that you can't just, we're not libertines, right? I talk about it in my book, but I go through a whole discussion of Philippians 4:8, and there is that whatever is pure, right? Whatever is honorable, whatever is of good repute. Like you go through that, not like you said, that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have expositions of wickedness, but it's very important that that exposition of the wickedness not be a stumbling block to wickedness in itself. And so those are the kinds of conversations that we do have with them. At the same time, when you read the scriptures, it should be the guideline for what is and is not permissible. And there is some salty stuff in the Bible. There is some really salty stuff in the Bible. So it's kind of like we as a culture have become so squeamish, and as a Christian culture, so squeamish, because we're afraid of liberating our artists and having them do the kinds of things that artists do in the world, which they're known for just slovenliness, drunkenness, undiscipline, all this other kind of stuff. It's like the cult of the artist. And I'm not into that at all. And I think that, again, I talk about the identity of the artist in my book, and I talk about how there's a difference between the identity that God gives us in the scriptures and within the church and the identity of the artist that's being propagated in the world. So yeah, we have all those conversations. But again, if they are truly believers, right, and they're trying to walk with God, they're going to make mistakes. They're going to sometimes cross boundaries. But I think it's better that we deal with that in charity and keep them within that community so that they can mature and grow over time, rather than saying, nope, absolutely not, you are cut off. And in that process, push them out into the world where there's no accountability at all, where they become further corrupted and perverted. And that has happened. One of my favorite artists, Sufjan Stevens, musical artist, I really wish that he had some accountability. The Gungers, they also have had no accountability, and it has not been good for them. Like, it would have been better had the church said, you're getting a little weird, but we'd rather you stay here and be in this community than go out there and just totally go into a tailspin.
That's an evangelism process the church is responsible to do, even within the arts.
Agreed, totally.
Yeah.
It's a little weirder for artists sometimes because artists can challenge. Think about it. If you were, which of the prophets did they not persecute? Which of the prophets did they not martyr? So like when you have an Isaiah and he's going up into the pulpit naked, like which he did, which it says he unfastened himself and just went in there totally shamefully, just completely naked to preach from the pulpit, you're going to have people in the church that are like, well, I don't think this is okay, you know, and maybe they have a conversation with Isaiah about this and be like, you know, Isaiah, that's taken a little bit too far. That whole eating poop thing that Ezekiel did, you know, or eating bread that was cooked over dung, you know, that's, again, kind of gross, like maybe taking it a little too far. There's a lot of stuff like that in the scriptures that indicates to me that sometimes more than what we're comfortable with might actually be acceptable. Now, again, we live in a community and we need to be considerate of other people and try and be charitable and work together, because it's not just the idea of the artist is all that's important. It's the case that the vision of the artist and the vision of the pastors and preachers who are reading in the Word, right? So I want to get those guys back together. I want to get them back together. I want artists learning from pastors. I want pastors learning from artists within the church community so that they can actually move forward together and actually make some progress.
There's a lot of symbolism in that too.
Yeah.
I find historically that art and worship have gone together a lot, and the Bible has talked a lot about the negatives of that, particularly with idolatry. How should the church view? Where's the line between art as you know, kind of a decoration of worship, and art as a medium or a channel of worship?
Yeah, so for instance, in the realm of iconography, you have a lot of people that are in the apostolic traditions who say that the difference between an idol and an icon is that the worship is terminal with an idol, and the worship passes through the icon to the object of worship. I don't necessarily buy that as such. I have a different tradition, but in the Old Testament, there's a really interesting example that I think is helpful. And what I'm going to come to the conclusion of saying is there isn't a clear dividing line here. There has to be discernment. There has to be charity and compassion and accountability over time. But because here's the thing, the superficial categorization that we use, the kind of content checklist that we use in order to determine what is and isn't permissible is not very scriptural. He even says, men judge by outward appearances, I judge by the heart. So let's look at Nehushtan. Are you familiar with Nehushtan? The bronze serpent.
Yes.
Okay, so Moses was actually commissioned to make the bronze serpent. So this is a piece of sculpture, bronze sculpture, that Moses was commissioned by God to make, so that any who looked upon it would be saved from the poisonous asps, from the vipers. So when you look at that, you're like, okay, God commissioned this art. It's permissible, right? I mean, he commissioned it, so it's not just permissible, like it has to be done. Moses lifts it up. People are looking at it, and when they have looked upon it with trust, in some senses looked through it to trust in God, by believing his promise that if they look upon it, they will be saved. They're sort of looking through it to him. Then they're spared. They're healed of these poisonous asps. A few hundred years later, though, Hezekiah, righteous King Hezekiah, finds that the people have named this bronze serpent Nehushtan, and they have been worshiping it, not God, not the God who saved them, but they've actually been worshiping this actual object. Now, if you're saying, well, was the object good or was the object bad? Was it permissible art or was it not permissible art? And what will talk about to a large extent, because he has a 3-stage of creation, which I like a lot, which is that art happens as a concept, and then it is crafted, and then it has a context. And the context is very important. So really, when you're taking this idea of, is Nehushtan a good piece of art, that can't actually be a superficial judgment. It takes the discernment of context, right? So like in the context that Nehushtan had been named and was being worshipped as an object of faith or salvation, bad art. When it was created by Moses at the commissioning of God for the healing of the people and as a sign, as a symbol of God's salvation, good art. Same object.
It was destroyed.
It was. Hezekiah destroyed it. And he was praised for doing so. So and again, I mean, you think about the golden calf that was made by Aaron, idolatry, but then Hiram made brazen calves to hold up the bath And they were removed by an idolater. So it's like, So the object themselves is not really, so we want to judge it superficially. Are calves okay or are calves not okay? And God's like, that's not really how this works. You need to get a little deeper than that and actually look into the meanings and the context of what's happening here, and not just these external superficial checklists that you guys want to go through in order to protect yourself, because that just leads to legalism. Ultimately, probably Nehushtan was worshipped because of that. Because they said, hey, God commissioned this. It's a good thing. It's an object of worship. Right? And so icons can quickly become idols. Even in the Catholic tradition. I mean, I've talked to a lot of Catholics who will talk about the danger of, and we can talk about that, but, should we hedge that entirely? How far do we got to pull that back? I mean, I was in a church one time where there were stones behind the pulpit, and they decided to cover those over with hospital white drywall so that the stones were not a distraction from the sermon. And I mean, this place looked like a hospital. And at a certain point, you're just like, I think maybe we're pushing it a little bit further, too far in the other direction. I mean, when you have such a sterile environment that people feel nothing but the cold, abstract words filtered, you know what I mean? It's like, there's something wrong here. Like, you guys are cutting a lot out here. Any other?
I'm sure the Sermon on the Mount was beautiful all around it.
It was, yeah.
The mountains.
And the Sermon on the Mount in itself is quite a delicious piece of poetry. I mean, it's lovely. So a lot of inversions, a lot of inversions of ideas. Even what he was talking about, the rending of the render. It's like, it's just beautiful because it's such a beautiful idea. And again, God loves that kind of stuff, and he wants us to find that kind of stuff. But if we're not looking at it in an artistic sense, we're not going to. So, and not just an artistic sense. I'm not saying throw out propositions either, okay? Obviously, and a lot of people will say, well, preaching is important, and preaching, sermons are important. I don't disagree. I totally agree. I don't think it's an either-or situation. I think it's a both-and situation. You need the propositions. You need the incarnations. That's why the Bible is written the way it's written. It has both, So, any others? We got maybe 3 minutes or so. One more. Will.
I was just thinking, it really does make most people, I think, uncomfortable. The more traditional, our periods kind of idea is that most of the time, in the same way that you've described prophets kind of being rejected in their own generations, most of the really innovative artists receive a similar welcome. And I think that's something that I don't necessarily have a specific question around, because I feel like I'm still working through maybe which side of that makes a little bit more sense. But that the artists in the church who are being supported by the church, it's gonna be a struggle that if those artists really are innovative, they're going to be making you uncomfortable.
Right.
And that's not something we really want.
Right.
But it's something we want to want.
Right. It's an interesting thing. So I talk to a lot of people who are musicians who despise Christian contemporary music. They don't listen to it. They think it's shallow, which it is. They think it's simplistic, which it is. They think it's trite, which it is. They think it's sentimental, which it is. All these things. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I think I'm on the same page with you. So you're a songwriter. Let's hear some of your music. And they'll show me these songs. I'm like, this is exactly the same stuff that you're criticizing. This is no different than what you're criticizing. But it's really hard to get out of the mode, because you make something that people aren't familiar with, and they're like, I don't like that, right? And I talk about this a little bit on the blog. I write a good bit, and one of the things I write about is the formation of taste formation. Taste formation is really difficult, because the issue with taste formation is, let's say you hate black licorice. Black licorice is delicious. If you hate black licorice, there's something wrong. No, I'm just joking. But if you wanted to develop a taste for black licorice, right, how would you do it? You can't convince yourself to like black licorice. There's no intellectual argument that is going to draw you closer to liking black licorice. You have to make a commitment to keep trying black licorice. Seriously. So every once in a while you're like, all right, there's some black licorice. Yep, still hate it, you know. And you do that and you keep doing it, but you continue to be open to developing a taste for something that people with some sense do like, right? So there are people out in the world who have some, you know, like for instance, there's a band that I like called the Bad Plus. They're a really great band, I think, jazz trio, but they like free jazz. So some of their stuff is more familiar jazz, you know, a little bebop, feels really good. And then they'll go into this free jazz excursions where it's just madness. And I know a few things about them. I know they're very good musicians. I know they're very intelligent. I know they're very humble. Like when I saw them live, they came out after the show and like met with all their fans, and I talked with all of them and had a long conversation. They're all these like Minnesota guys, you know, just like really down to earth. And so I'm sitting here going, it may be the case that if I don't like this, there's something wrong with me and not something wrong with it. It might be the case that I need to sort of free myself a little bit to at least attempt to like it. And I think that the church should do that a lot. When you have art within the church that's being made by somebody and you're like, this is a godly young man, he doesn't seem insane, and he says that he's called by God to the arts, and he's got great craft, like he's obviously really working very hard, disciplining himself to the craft, but he's making this stuff that I don't like. Well, maybe try. Maybe try to like it. Try to like it. I'm not saying you have to. I'm not saying if you don't like it that you're a terrible person. Because, I mean, like I said, there's lots of intelligent, great things that I don't really appreciate. Lots of really heartfelt things that I don't really appreciate. But I think that we should be open to try. And if you keep on giving yourself an opportunity to try, eventually you'll find that your tastes can change over time. There are things that I didn't like 5 years ago that I like now because I gave myself the opportunity to like them by continued exposure. So that's...
I feel like part of that is our issue we have in churches is that we have a preconceived notion of what is okay, and we forget that all people are created in the image of God. And all people are different. Therefore, what brings out of them will be different than us.
That's right.
And we have a hard time being okay with different, even though God looks at his children in humanity, because we know that in the Bible that God gives grace to all mankind, not just believers, though a special grace to believers. But all people have been given gifts by God because he created them in their image.
That's right.
And therefore, it's so hard for the church to look at not the normal people and look at them and say, they're also created by the image of God. And God has also blessed them in their craft or art. And our job would be to look at that and be like, even though I don't like it or it's weird, it's still something that God has put his hand on.
That's right.
You know?
And if you submit yourself to that value, then you're doing work to stitch together those disparate parts of that tabernacle veil. So, you know, there's, like you said, there's diversity and unity. The work we need to do is to make an effort to stitch together, and I think a lot of that comes by submitting ourselves to other people's value. God has a value for you, may not be my value. I'm going to submit myself to that value, try to see it, try to understand it, try to love it, and through that we can be more woven together. I think you had...
We can see in history, though, and even as you live longer in this life, that artists, musicians, artwork that we may have liked when they were in their 20s, that it goes one way or another. Like it either gets darker and their images become more blurred and distorted and more towards like even dark, or they become better and more beautiful and more, you know,
more precise.
Yeah, it's more precise. I mean, they become more enjoyable. Like you see improvement. You either see improvement in a man's works or writings, or you see, I liked his first work, but I don't like what he's writing today. I mean, I have some artists that I followed in my 20s that I thought were doing good work that I don't listen to anymore.
Yeah, no, I've had very similar
Maybe
experiences.
what you're saying, maybe if they had stayed in the church, because, initially I was like, oh yeah, they were Christians. But now, you're like questioning, you're like wondering. And, I often don't take the time to find out, where they are in their spiritual life because I don't know them, or but you can see a distancing instead of a more closeness.
Totally, and I don't think that should be set aside either. That sometimes our when we hear a piece of art and we don't like it or we don't appreciate it or we don't whatever. Sometimes it's because we haven't taken the time to appreciate where they're coming from, but other times it's because what they're doing is actually really ugly and awful, and there's good reason to set it aside. So I'm not,
Their works do
yeah.
display, their works do, they either display the glory of God eventually, or they do display that they were, that they are more in their natural nature, in
Right.
a sense, because they're not going, there's not a movement to a closeness to God,
Although
and
I
it's precept, like beauty and goodness,
takes discernment even there though, because I have seen artists that have developed and sort of taken a direction I can't follow them in. Not necessarily a bad direction, just one that I mean, this happened to me a number of times where the first record comes out from a band and I'm like, I like this record, this is a good record. Second record comes out and I'm like, what in the world? This came out of left field, I do not like this. But I liked their first record and these guys don't seem like they're totally off their rockers. What kind of direction did they take? Like what kind of influences have they started to incorporate that are unfamiliar to me? Sometimes it's like you say, there's some sort of a tailspin happening from a lack of accountability or some other thing that's happening there, moral thing that's being injected. Other times it's just they've incorporated other styles or other things or other ideas, and I'm not yet. I didn't follow the line from the first to the second, so I'm not where they are when I hear the second record, and I have to sort of fill in the gaps a little bit, do a little bit of work to get there. Sometimes it doesn't happen, sometimes it does, but taking the time to try, I think is really important. All right, that's an hour. Thank you very much, guys.